Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Julia Grimes, the Deputy Director of the Dunhuang Foundation. It is an immense pleasure, as always, to be with you. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in to today's webinar on China, the Spanish Americas, and the early modern maritime Silk Roads. It is my great honor now to introduce the host of today's talk, Shih-shan Susan Huang, who, along with Eric Huntington, is our collaborator for this lecture series on transnationality and the Silk Roads. Shih-shan Susan Huang received her PhD in the history of art from Yale. Huang is an associate professor at Rice University's newly founded Department of Transnational Asian Studies. She's the author of Picturing the True Form, Taoist Visual Culture in Traditional China, which was published by the Harvard Asia Center in 2012. A Chinese translation by Dr. Zhu Yiwen was published by the Zhejiang University Press last year in 2022. Huang co-edited Visual and Material Cultures in Middle Period China with Patricia Ebry, which was published by Brill in 2017. And her recent articles explore Sung to Ming book art of the Lotus Sutra and the Diamond Sutra, Buddhist printing under Tangut Xixia rule, and painting and printing connections. Huang is currently completing a monograph, The Dynamic Spread of Buddhist Print Culture, mapping Buddhist book roads in China and its neighbors. I'll now hand the floor over to Susan, who will introduce our speaker today, Dr. Angela Schottenhammer. Thank you so much, Susan.
Thank you so much, Julia, for your introduction. And hello, everyone. It's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Angela Schottenhammer, also internationally known as Xiaoting in the field of China studies. Dr. Schottenhammer is a full professor of Chinese Middle Period and Early Modern World History at KU Leuven in Belgium, and is also a research affiliate at the Geography Department at Ghent University in Belgium. In addition, from 2009 to 2020, she was a research director and adjunct professor at the Indian Ocean World Center at McGill University in Canada. Dr. Schottenhammer obtained her PhD in 1993 from Wolfsburg University with a thesis on Song period tomb inscriptions, and her habilitation degree in 2000 from LMU Munich University with a thesis on the port city of Quanzhou during the Song period, 960 to 1279. Her research focuses on Chinese history, archaeology, science and technology, and on China's and Asia's global interaction and interconnectivity through both maritime and overland routes. Dr. Schottenhammer plays many leadership roles in the field. She is the director of the Crossroads Research Center and chief editor of the academic journal Crossroads. She's also editor of 2 transnational book series. The first, published by Harazovis since 2002, is East Asian Economic and Social-Cultural Studies, East Asian Maritime History. The Chinese title is 东亚经济与社会文化论丛. There are already 16 volumes published. The second, published by Brill since 2018, is Crossroads, The History of Interaction Along the Silk Routes. I'm happy to share that our co-host, Dr. Eric Huntington's co-edited volume, Overlapping Cosmology in Asia, was published in this series. And our last speaker from last December, Dr. Satomi Hiyama, also contributed a chapter in Dr. Huntington's co-edited volume. Last but not least, Dr. Schottenhammer's own forthcoming monograph, China and the Silk Road, circa 100 BC to 1800 AD, will also be published by this series soon, I think later this month. I will add links to all these journal and book series in the chat box later. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Angela Schottenhammer.
Thank you very, very much, Susan. So thank you very much for this nice introduction. I would like to provide you today with several aspects on, maybe a little bit forgotten, chapter of China's maritime history, namely the Trans-Pacific connection. And there is a lot of information, so please apologize if sometimes I will be a little bit brief, but we will look into various maps, some images, and I also like to introduce you to some specific medicinal plants, and also cacao and some other commodities, and also knowledge that was exchanged. So let's see how this works. Okay. This is just a general map to give you a general idea. What you see here are the main routes, and then of course we have several smaller sub-routes. It's just a general overview, and I can always come back to this map if you want to see it later. The interesting question, of course, is what would you expect the Chinese knew about Peru and about the Trans-Pacific connection in the early modern period? As a rule, it's not only said that, especially during Ming times, and this Trans-Pacific connection officially started in 1565, so in the mid-16th century, in High Ming times, that the Ming then actually, they first closed down their country and were not really interested then that much in places overseas, especially if they were further away. And in the official record, actually, one reads a little about Asia Pacific, Trans-Pacific, not to speak of New Spain or about Peru. Actually, I think what we will see is that there was a lot of interaction going on, but mainly by private merchants, and that what was officially recorded, especially as far as the Ming dynasty is concerned, was relatively restricted. If we look to the official sources like Minshu, Mingshi, Dongxi Yangkao, and there are also some others, in the Ming period, we read, for example, about a Mount Shih-shan, and there was a guy called Zhang Yi, and he reported that in Luzon there was this kind of Mount Ji, and there was a tree with growing beans full of gold, and that one could harbor them. And if the emperor would send a mission then to Luzon, they could become very wealthy and just get these beans. So this story is a kind of, very, very fancy. There was a lot of opposition behind this mission, but in the end, the emperor sent a mission to Manila, to Cavite, and then they inquired about this Mount Ge. There is a whole background story to this. The Spanish, of course, they were laughing when they heard about a tree with gold beans. And if you read through this official report, you would ask yourself, could it really be that the Chinese were actually really thinking that gold was there growing on a tree, and that they were not aware that the Spanish had come from another continent, crossed the ocean, and that they brought lots of silver, and that gold was locally mined also in the Philippines. To make a long story short, in the end, of course, this mission left again. It raised also the suspicion a bit about the Chinese. There was already a Chinese settlement, a Chinese community in Manila. They were called the Sanglays, and you may know that briefly afterwards, there was also a massacre of the Chinese. This guy, Zhang Yi, he was later executed in China because he had distributed all these lies. But if you look a little bit behind the scene, then it's clear that the Chinese probably already at that time, so in mid-Ming times, they knew more about what official sources would report. And they were also aware that gold was being mined in the Philippines, and that the silver was coming across the ocean from another continent and was transported by the Spanish. How especially did the Chinese know more about the new Spanish continent, about the Americas? This was, of course, one thing by private merchants who were trading with the Spanish and the Philippines, but of course, also especially by missionaries. And very famous, you all know it, is the map of the missionary Matteo Ricci. And we will have a brief look at this map, because it also marks the famous silver city, the Potosi mountain, which is sometimes on the map simply generally called Inshan, and sometimes here you see it's transcribed as Beidusi Shan. Okay. I'm sorry, probably you cannot really detect this here. We will have another image soon, but this is here the general section of Matteo Ricci's map. And here, I hope it's a Japanese copy, so don't wonder why there are hiragana here and katakana on the map. Here you see the Peruvian Sea, and then you see here a mountain range. Here you see, I hope it's visible, Beidusi Shan, Shan Du In Kuang. So this is a reference here to Potosi. You have here Peru, and you even have other places. It takes you into Brazil, into here Chile and other places, but important for us is here that it marks the Potosi and the Cerro Rico. Then this map by Matteo Ricci, part of it is also copied later in a map produced by Giulio Aleni. And actually what we have found out, also my colleague Elke Papelitsky, who is particularly working on maps, she has also found out that actually the impact in China of Giulio Aleni's work was probably more than of Matteo Ricci's map, even though the former is better known. And Giulio Aleni, he also not only produced a map, he put, interestingly, the Cerro Rico, the Silver City, he put it into New Spain, New Castile, and not into Peru. He transcribed Potosi a little bit differently, but basically a lot of information is also taken from Matteo Ricci. And if you look to his text, then it's also quite interesting because Aleni, he mentions, for example, Canada, he mentions the Magellan Straits, as well as Christopher Columbus and Amerigo Vespucci. And he even describes llamas or alpacas, and also, for example, the local Chipu script. So the book of Giulio Aleni probably circulated more widely also in the Chinese intellectual, among the Chinese intellectual elites. And so a lot of information was actually taken to China, and you could get information about New Spain. Interestingly also, there is also a passage about sea routes. So this is a quote here, and he describes basically two routes. So the Spanish, either they took the Strait of Magellan into the Pacific Ocean, or through the territory of New Spain, and then the land route to the Sea of Peru. And you know, the starting point also from New Spain, the port was Acapulco, but also from Peru, what is nowadays Lima, the port of Lima. Ships also anchored there, and then first sailed to Acapulco, and only during a relatively brief period, the direct trans-Pacific trade from Lima to the Philippines was permitted. Later it was prohibited, but this would lead too far at this point. You will see here at least, or you see here at least, that he describes briefly this Trans-Pacific road, and says then from the Sea of Peru, they pass the Moluccas, Luzon and other islands, and then they reach the great Ming Sea and arrive at Guangzhou. Guangzhou, of course, was a major port, and one should keep in mind, of course, that the Portuguese were sitting in Macau, and also the Portuguese actually played a major role in this trans-Pacific trade. It was not only the Spanish, but also Portuguese. And we know also that some Chinese, of course, they boarded Spanish ships and were also traveling to New Spain or Peru. But there is unfortunately very, very little concrete evidence about this. Now I would like to take you into a few more maps. It's just to display a little bit, how knowledge about Peru, or about the Cerro Rico, about the silver, about New Spain was portrayed on maps, because it's quite interesting, and it's one of the particularities or characteristics of some Chinese maps, that the actual location or also the distance did not really matter that much. To be an island in the sea, like here, you see it on the top here, this meant that this place was quite important to the Chinese. Here you see this is New Castile again, and here you see again Qi Di Du Jin In Ren Bao Gu Ming, Castilia. So here you see again the reference to New Spain. Then you have here even coconut mountain range. Even here the Amazonas is mentioned here, also like a kind of island placed in the sea. And this is opposite the east coast of China, and from the distance here, it's very close located to the Chinese coast. Then yet another map here. This is later 17th century. This map also it places South America, where geographically speaking, the Philippines should be located. This we have just seen also on this other map here. It also mentions Peru, but does not include Potosi as the Silver Mountain. And you will see that the name for Pacific Ocean is placed west of the Ryukyu Islands. So one from the correct geographic knowledge or so, it's a little bit mixed or so, but it does not mean that the Chinese had absolutely no idea. It was just not really that important where exactly this was placed. Here you see the American continent. Here again, this is the Chinese coast. You discover here Fuzhou, for example. You have here Brazil, and you have here again Peru. Then here Yamor Lydia, this is the Americas. And if you go further, you see here this square explaining some historical background about the Ryukyu Islands. And then you have here the Taiping Yang, Dongnanhai. So it's quite interesting. These maps, if you look to the waves, by the way, this is traditional way of portraying sea or maritime space, oceanic space. Interestingly, and this first attracted my also attention when I looked to one of these maps. You just have seen that here are stories, sometimes squares or circles, and they tell you some stories. Mostly, traditionally, it was brief wrapping up of the history of paying tribute of this place to China, but sometimes you also have other information. And what caught my attention is that there was an information about Peru. It said Peru produces an aromatic called balsam. The tree produces an oil, and when the tree is cut with a knife, the oil leaks out. Applied on dead corpses, these do not decompose. The place where the tree has been cut recovers completely after 12 hours. The country of Judea, this is in the Middle East, also has this kind of tree. So you can ask yourself, why is this information, why did the Chinese think it was important or consider it important to tell the map reader about this kind of balsam? This, I think, it's quite interesting, and it was not only on the Matteo Ricci map, but it appeared also on later maps. Here you see again here the section from Matteo Ricci's map. Here's Bolu, and this is here the section that tells you about this balsam resin and this balsam oil, which is also employed to embalm dead corpses, and it's also being used for skin diseases, by the way. And then this is this later map here from 1743 here. And you see here quite nicely, here is a kind of mountain peak placed in the ocean. Very close here, here's Wenzhou. And again, if you can read it, Beidou Shih-shan. And again, this story that this mountain produces lots of silver ore. Here further down, you have Peru, Bolu, and again, this story about the balsam that is being used. Then here you have another circle. This is about Concho. So it's quite interesting. Why were the Chinese so interested in this Peruvian balsam? Also, a scholar, he took up this story, and we find this quote about the balsam also in the Wu Li Xiao Shi by Fang Yizhi. He also just has a small passage speaking about this balsam, and also says that it's used to balsam corpses, but also for skin diseases, and also applied for smallpox. And we all know that smallpox, it was a big problem around that time. So obviously, this mummification really fascinated some Chinese scholars, so that this information was reproduced on maps and also in some texts. There are other entries also in the Zhefang Weidi. I also already explained that it even speaks about the local script, about llamas and various other just local characteristics. Then if we look to China, this balsam, did this information have any impact among the Chinese scholars at the Chinese imperial court or in local society? What we know, and we have both still archaeological evidence, but also written textual evidence that, for example, at the imperial court, they used so-called xiangqiu, fragrance and incense balls, and they also used this balsam for it. This was, how did the balsam come to China? It was mostly presented as a gift to members of the ruling elite of the court by Portuguese or other envoys, and so the Chinese came to know about it. And the missionaries, of course, they also used it in their own hospitals and also in their own medicinal recipes. This is here an image. It was taken from the Palace Museum in Beijing. Here is a kind of recipe. This is another balsam container, and I downloaded this from the Welcome collection. So this is the way you see how this balsam was transported and then just given, for example, as a gift to members of the imperial court. What I found then perhaps most interesting, I just said that it was also applied for skin diseases. The quotations I presented say that it can heal wounds very quickly, and it's also applied to smallpox. This is that the balsam was apparently also used among or in the Manchu army. And I found a quote here by a Mongol general of the Qing army who really asked the emperor then that he should take care about asking the foreign envoys to bring more of this kind of balsam. And obviously, of course, then in the army for sword wounds, or if some of the soldiers had some open wounds on the skin, apparently it was also tested and really had good effect, so that this general really asked for more balsam. I'm still looking for more information, and I have always been hoping to find more maybe in some Manchu sources, but to this moment, unfortunately, this is the only thing I have. It would be great to discover at some point maybe a kind of a recipe or a description how this balsam was really applied then to an open wound at a soldier who was serving in the army. Not only this balsam, this was just one example. We have many, many more medicinals and fragrances, of course, not only from the Americas, but also from the Indian Ocean. Also the Portuguese brought something from India, and Indian Ocean trade, of course, was also important. But balsam, or here jalap root, these were some of the medicinals and fragrances that were transported to China from the Americas. Something that you may already have heard about, and that is also quite important. This is the so-called Peruvian bark, Cinchona officinalis. And this is also a well-known story that the Jesuits, they treated the Kangxi emperor with Peruvian bark, and it was applied against malaria. And the Kangxi emperor was really very, very fond it. You see here, this was in the late 17th century, and they had treated successfully the emperor of a malarial fever in July 1693, and Kangxi highly valued this Peruvian bark. He is quoted with the words, "The West has a kind of tree bark called jinjina that cures illnesses of intermittent fevers with just one dose." So you can see that using medicines is a case of using them for the right syndromes. And he was also asking then the missionaries for more Peruvian bark. And one might think that, of course, all these substances, the balsam then, or here Peruvian bark, circulated only among the imperial court. But as you have seen, the balsam at least made its way into the Manchu army. And from Zhao Xuemin's Benzao Gangmu Shi, we know that by 1765, at the latest, this Peruvian bark had also entered Chinese medical works. Because it was brought first by the Jesuits, it was also called Jesuit bark. This is here a quotation then from Zhao Xuemin's work. And you see here that he quotes yet another text, and also says here the bark is used to treat malaria. And the foreigners in Macau, they have a special recipe. Here you see it's taken with cinnamon and then made into a decoction. And it's also transmitted by the foreigners of Macau. And the fact that this entered, of course, a Chinese medicinal text or so, this also shows that it was known a little bit more widely and was not a singular gift to the Chinese emperor. In a letter, this is also late 18th century, also we read that plans were also made in China to increase the consumption of Peruvian bark in Asia, and that the exportation via Acapulco to the Philippines was really promoted. And of course, many of these substances, medicinals, they came to China via Manila, via the Philippines, because the galleons, of course, they crossed the Pacific from Acapulco to Manila, and then it was transported further. Now a completely different chapter. This is also something you would not link up with China if you hear about cacao. I will not go into too much detail about the use of cacao in China, but only tell a little bit about its introduction into China and how it made its way to China, because there is an excellent book chapter also by a colleague of mine on chocolate in China. So chocolate was used as a provision on board of the Manila galleons. This is really what we know from several descriptions. And my colleague, Mathieu Torque, has recently also found out that chocolate apparently was even also used on board of ships as a diet to prohibit scurvy, or at least as a diet to alleviate the consequences of scurvy, similarly as the drinking of green tea on board of Chinese ships. This is also a quite interesting story. if we look through all the Spanish documents and the cargo lists, you can rarely find chocolate or cacao beans really as a commodity, but it was probably really carried on board of ship as, either as a gift, or it was part also as of the personal belongings of people. And then they distributed it further in the Philippines and further in China. We have some records from various origins. Here, William Dampier, an English navigator, also a pirate, for example, he describes that the ships from Lima, from Peru, they bring, among other things, cacao. Early 18th century, cacao is loaded on board together with water. Guayaquil, the most high quality cacao, actually came from Guatemala. The cheaper one was from Guayaquil, and sometimes we also read about the distinctions, but frequently it's also, it's only about cacao in general. Then Gemelli Carreri, of course, he also described that cacao was part of the personal provisions on board of ships. And he also confirms that the cacao plant, as probably as a seed, were taken from New Spain to the Philippines. This would lead us here too far, but it's very interesting that in the Philippines, especially in the 18th century, the cultivation of cacao was extremely promoted. And especially, this is quite interesting, then some people said, you receive a bonus if you plant so many cacao trees and so many other trees. And we can use also the cacao in order to substitute the payments for the Chinese, who are bringing all these commodities that Manila is dependent on. And instead of paying them with all the silver, we can also use, among other things, cacao to pay them. So there must have been a kind of demand, but most probably it was only among some elites and probably, of course, the Westerners, missionaries or others who were living in China. But the idea, at least, that among other things, cultivation of cacao should substitute for payments in silver, I found this quite interesting. We also have other evidence. For example, here, the galleon called Nuestra Señora de Begoña, it attests to shipment of chocolate and cacao, the Maracaibo, and also to vanilla. And this is also quite interesting because in addition, also with another register here of the Nuestra Señora de Covadonga, this is also a quite important document. This explicitly speaks of cacao from Venezuela that was also then transported to Acapulco and then shipped across the Pacific and reached first Manila and then further China. Just to give you a few other examples, as I just mentioned, the cargo lists mostly don't speak about chocolate or cacao. It's more a kind of gift or personal belongings. We know that the cacao plant was transplanted in the Philippines. And now, if we look to China, who consumed cacao in China? We know it was also given as a gift to the Kangxi Emperor. And I still recall a Manchu text that we were reading when Martin Gim, about 20 years ago, was giving a Manchu class at Munich University. And we read the text, how a Jesuit just introduced chocolate to the Kangxi emperor, and he tasted it then. He, of course, thought it was a kind of medicine, but in the end, the emperor didn't really like it very much. And he then just said, "Chocolat booby song," so you don't have to send chocolate anymore. And as I mentioned, the story about the use of chocolate at the Manchu court, there is really a very, very nicely written book chapter about this. I can tell you then later. Then a little bit more about the transfer of medicinal knowledge or knowledge about plants, about botanica. There is also the book of a Spanish Franciscan missionary, and the Franciscans, by the way, were also very active in establishing, for example, hospitals, pharmacies, and we learn a lot about the medicinal treatment and about the substances they used. Here we have the missionary Pedro de la Pinuela. And he wanted to describe plants that originally did not grow in China. And he provided a detailed description, and including medicinal uses and even recipes. And among other things, for example, he speaks about lavender, about tobacco, about the so-called fruit of Luzon, the Strychnos ignatii beans, as it is called. And he also has recipes. He does not mention cacao in his brief work, but we have another attestation, because here he speaks that chocolate really should be sent to China. And he said that sick people come to this house, and some guests who are in the ministries, be it for big colds or for weaknesses of the stomach, what they need really for some comfort is, especially during fasting days, this is really chocolate and cacao. And we especially have references about the use of cacao and chocolate drinking. It was mostly drunk from these missionaries. And most probably it was also the missionaries or some hospitals that in their gardens they planted also cacao trees and maybe produced their own cacao. But we frequently also read in documents about gifts or about kind of sendings of cacao chocolate from Manila to China. Much comes from letters here, where we read a little bit about cacao here with vanilla. Chocolate was received as annual alms to the Franciscan mission in China. And missionaries also refer to the use of chocolate as a pharmaceutical and as a medicine. Interestingly, this is something I can't further expand here during this talk, is interestingly, cacao beans that were used as a money in Spanish, in the Americas among the Aztecs, were for some time even used as a money on the Philippines. So this is also a quite interesting chapter. Here I brought together just a few examples of missionaries who referred to chocolate for medicinal purposes. Also, here preparation and you know that it was used, it was consumed in China, but probably known only among the upper levels of society and especially among foreigners. Here are again some examples. Much of this trade from Manila went to either Macau or Guangzhou. I have not found that much evidence in the trade between Fujian and Manila. I'm still hoping that I can find more information about local cultivation, but as I mentioned, most probably it was basically cultivated in the private gardens of missionary hospitals, pharmacies, or also their own private house gardens. Chocolate, we know, was also popular among Catholic nuns. I want to thank my colleague from Chile, who brought this very long document of more than 2,500 pages to my attention. And we discovered in it a kind of a letter where a Catholic nun just thanks her sister in Manila for sending chocolate to Macau. So indirectly, we do have quite some evidence about the sending of cacao. China, of course, was not only involved as a kind of destination country because this was sent to missionaries, but for China, chocolate had much more important implications in terms of providing the containers, the cups, the chocolateros in which the chocolate was drunk, and a real ceramics industry developed in China. And these chocolateros and pozuelos, they were transported of course, on board of these Manila galleons to Spanish America, to Acapulco. You see here, to give you some figures, in these 14 years between 1740 and 1745 alone, more than 500,000 pozuelos were being shipped across the Pacific. And these chocolateros and pozuelos, they were not only produced in China, even though China, of course, was the main source. But I don't know if this is readable, but they were also just produced in Japan. You see here, it's pozuelo de chocolate de loza de Japón, so also the Japanese actually produced chocolate cups and chocolate dishes for the new Spanish market. This is just here an example of how a chocolatero jar, how it looked like, probably for chocolate beans. If you comb the internet, you will find some examples also of chocolate cups from this time. So you see here, it's quite an interesting story. And we even know that Chinese residing in Manila, they also prepared chocolate. They empowdered it and prepared the chocolate and went from house to house and then offered chocolate there. So they were involved in various ways into this kind of chocolate business or chocolate trade, even though chocolate per se didn't have such big impact on Chinese society and Chinese economy, of course. Now I briefly come to a few other New World crops and plants. You know, of course, the sweet potato. This is something also introduced from the Americas. It reached Lingnan in 1580 via Annam. It is also mentioned in Chaozhou prefecture in the 1580s. Shortly afterwards, sweet potatoes were planted throughout Guangdong province, and sweet potatoes, they conquered, you can say, the agricultural sector in not only China, because sweet potato was not demanding and it was easy to cultivate, needed no fertilizer, and had a high yield. And it is repeatedly mentioned also then as a food for the poor. Zhu Dajun, in his Guangdong Xinyu, very famous local work describing Guangdong and what was happening there. He has a brief entry also on the sweet potato, and he says it has recently been introduced from Luzon. It is very easy to grow. The leaves can be used to fatten pigs. The roots can be fermented into liquor, also quite important, and they can be dried and stored. Maize, also something you all know as being introduced from the Americas, according to Zhu Dajun, is not eaten much in Lingnan, in Guangdong. We read more about maize than in the mountainous hinterlands, for example, of Fujian and other places. Zhu Dajun's work, by the way, there are also translations or part translations. So if you are interested in this work, I can later also share a little bit of information. Tobacco was a purely commercial plant, and it exhausted soils, and it spread, according to what we know from the especially defuncture evidence, only in the later 18th century. Peanuts, of course, this is also something. And I just want to mention that as far as these New World crops and plants, as far as research is concerned, recently various scholars have looked a little bit into more detail into the introduction of these crops and plants and the impacts they had in China. But I would say, still a standard article is still by He Pingdi, the introduction of American food plants into China. This is from 1955, but it's still a kind of a basic and standard work. Maize, it was, or corn, it was not only used as a food, but it was also used as medicinal. This is quite interesting. It has various nutritional values. I won't go into detail here, but this is just to provide you with some basic information. And you see here also medicinal uses. For example, diuretic as disinfectant, anesthetic. It is repeatedly mentioned in various medicinal texts also to cure urine dropping. And as I write here or so, it is basically only promoted in the Qianlong reign period, and there is little evidence before this. It's also mentioned to cure diabetes, quite interesting, and then repeatedly also for as distilled spirits. Then what is very interesting in this context is that the claimed first Chinese medical work mentioning mice for its medicinal properties actually stems from before this trans-Pacific trade was initiated, and before mice could have reached China through the Spaniards and the Manila galleon trade. Here, this is the reference of the Dien an Benzhao by Lan Mao. And you see here, this quotation is a clear reference also to mice. And if this is correct, the mice was actually introduced prior to the discovery of America, and it was only reintroduced by the Spanish and Portuguese. There is here a Chinese work by Yo Xiu Ling, and he actually in detail describes also this kind of earlier reference. Of course, we know it was introduced from the Philippines by Spanish and Portuguese, but with this reference, it was only a reintroduction, and knowledge about it must have entered China prior to that, and probably via another Silk Road and from the Indian Ocean and the Central Asian area. This is just briefly here, we have a text, a Portuguese text that describes what kind of products actually were taken from China to Peru. And what you see here is repeatedly, it basically speaks about all kinds of silks and fabrics. And so very easily the imagination or the image might appear that only these products were traded. But as you have seen, this exchange was much, much wider, and many, many more products were exchanged, including the knowledge about how to cultivate them or how to consume them. This is here, you see here, it's about the mercadorias that reach Mexico and from China, and from Mexico then go to Peru. Then something else I want to mention are ivory objects. Of course, the ivory most probably first came from the Indian subcontinent, or even further away, possibly also from Africa. And you see here even a fan made in ivory, but figurines and all kinds of other ivory objects that have been found then in private collections, also in churches in Latin American countries, also in private collections. And this here now, this image stems from local museum. Here, this is a Jesus Christ figure. We also have a sunken Manila galleon where archaeologists, maritime archaeologists, found lots of ivory objects on board. Then as far as the textiles are concerned, how this looked like, of course, pairs of stockings. Stockings is also something that is repeatedly mentioned, and also in these cargo lists, also in personal gifts. Then handkerchiefs here, these pañuelos, also frequently in all kinds of colors or so. This is also something frequently mentioned. Then fans, also of course made in fabrics. We have seen even ivory. Then I just briefly want to say a little bit more about individual networks and personal relations. I mentioned in the beginning that, from the Chinese official historiography, you would suspect that almost nothing is known about the Americas, about trans-Pacific trade. and that not much was happening, and maybe only silk was coming from the Cerro Rico and shipped across the Pacific, and it was exchanged for silver and exchanged for silks and for ceramics, and not much more. But one really has to look behind the official historiography and piece together lots of detailed information. And then we see not only how many commodities, how many products were exchanged, but we also come across many, many names and the networks, including just financial networks and what was happening. Here we have some names, for example. These are Macau Portuguese merchants. I mentioned that Portuguese merchants from Macau were also quite active in this trade. And you also find them repeatedly mentioned in Spanish sources. A local banker, here is just one name. A Peruvian colleague, she has written a book on these commercial and financial networks. So I just want to mention this, and one sees then how much money was involved and how widespread this network was, and how many actually individuals of the Peruvian society were actually also involved in this trade. This also leads you a little bit away from the traditional Acapulco-Manila trade, a little bit more southward, and opens the eyes also to Lima and the society in Lima and Peru. Then, of course, we have evidence also from customs reports, or here fabrics were confiscated. Then, as I mentioned, long cargo lists, but also personal wills, testamentos. They tell you a lot about what was exchanged and what kind of products local individuals received from China. It included, for example, also writing desks, escritorios. So furniture was also part and parcel of this kind of exchange. What about the Chinese? I mentioned that unfortunately there is little evidence about individuals whom we know by name, who crossed the Pacific and were active. We know that Chinese were sailing on board of the Spanish Manila galleons. This is one early example of migrants. One also has to be careful, because what is mentioned here as Chino or Indio, that they came from China here did not always necessarily mean that they were really from China. One really has to investigate it in detail. But we know that at least some Chinese, especially, of course, from Fujian, but also from the Guangdong area, that they also boarded the Manila galleons, and then they locally settled in New Spain and also in Peru. And interestingly, many of these Chinos and Indios, they were obviously tailors. And they are mentioned here in this source as abridor de cuellos. And I was first wondering what this means. It's literally speaking, it's a collar opener. But if you look to the local clothing tradition of the elites or so, one understands what this was. An abridor de cuello was a person whose job it was to hollow out the folds of the crepe collars there. Interestingly, there's also some evidence that these sastres or tailors also Chinese, of Chinese, so-called Chinese origin, that they used their tailor shops also in order to store smuggling goods that evaded customs and were stored then in Lima, to distribute it further, not only in Lima, but even as far away as Argentina, for example. So let me come to a conclusion. We see here now how manifold the exchanges across the Pacific actually were, and that many Chinese were in one way or the other involved in this exchange. We have seen various medicinals, plants, also knowledge. We have seen ceramics, of course, also fabrics, textiles, silks, but also lots of private stories. And I think that we really have to look beyond the official historiography, because if you recall what or how I initiated this talk, what I said in the beginning, these fancy stories about this Shih-shan with trees where golden beans are growing, and that it provides you with the imagination that the Chinese had absolutely no idea of what was really going on. We know that probably already in Ming times, definitely the private merchants knew more about it, and then the knowledge was continuously increasing, and by the early 17th century, a lot of more was known about this. The Chinese were also interested and were also knowing about the technology, also about how, for example, the silver was mined. This is also something the Japanese, for example, were also very interested in. So the knowledge exchange was also increasing. Then, just for background information, if we look to China, 17th century, one should also have in mind that, of course, there was the coastal evacuation or relocation policy. This, of course, was a big setback for the commercial relations between China and Manila, and then further on the Americas. A lot of smuggling was, of course, going on, but officially, especially the Kangxi Emperor was very suspicious also of the Sangleis and of the Chinese who had emigrated from China, especially from Fujian. And in 1717, he even prohibited Chinese ships to sail to Southeast Asia. The Yongzheng Emperor, even though he had a very cautious eye on what was going on along the maritime border, and he was he very much cared about coastal defense also, and both Kangxi and Yongzheng said that they had to closely watch what the Europeans were doing there, but also in face of empty state coffers, this maritime, this prohibition to trade with Southeast Asia, it was lifted. And especially in face of all the silver that the Spanish brought. And here we see that particularly the Fujian merchants were very, very, very active, and they imported lots of silver then into Fujian. And in the 18th century, then this trade really flourished a lot. But again, we know more from unofficial sources, And we need to keep in mind that this trade was really maintained basically by private merchants. Then the local Chinese diaspora, the Sangleis, they also played a major role in this trade. And from all these kind of documents, from private letters up to some records that we find on board of Spanish ships, for example, we gradually come to know more about this kind of trade. So I thank you very much. I know I have to stop here, and I hope it was not too much information, but if you want, I can provide you then also with some more evidence and articles to read more about this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Angela. This is a mind-blowing talk with so much knowledge across the world. We have already 7 typed questions. So if you in the audience have questions, please type your question in the Q&A. Let's start with something general. The first question is, could you briefly explain what is balsam? Just very briefly.
Yeah. Okay, it's there is a special tree. It is also called balsam tree because it produces this resin, and it's a kind of resin that when you cut the trunk of the tree, then it drops out and it's being collected. And it's a complicated thing, and these trees only grow under special conditions. You have to be very careful or so, but it's a kind of the sap that drops out from this tree. Mm.
Okay, great. Let's move on to the next question. What is the name of your colleague who studied chocolate? This audience would like to know.
Yeah.
So,
actually, I myself started basically to study this chocolate. I prepared a long chapter on this and collected all the information, and I hope to be able to publish it soon. But if you are referring to the chocolate in China, this is Beatriz Puente, what's her name? Sorry. I'm sometimes
maybe we can...
Ballesteros, Puente Ballesteros. She's at Tübingen University. And I can provide you with a copy of this book chapter. It's really, she in detail also investigates this Manju document that I mentioned that we read in our Manju course. It's very interesting.
Good. So Jennifer, we will communicate with you via Dunhuang Foundation, and we can...
I have a digital copy. Yeah,
okay. Great. Now let's move on to Sarah's question. She said her late colleague David Ringrose in her book Europeans Abroad wrote that if she...
Who?
David Ringrose.
Okay,
you know, say that the Spanish galleon to Malina were largely built and manned by Chinese people. She would like to know if this is true.
Yeah, actually, together with my 2 colleagues, the maritime archaeologists, we just agreed to prepare a chapter on shipbuilding, and they will take care about the construction and how this developed and how much knowledge exchange there was between Chinese, also Japanese, Spanish, Portuguese. And I promised to write a little bit more also on shipyards. And what I have found so far and what we know, and also other Spanish and Latin American colleagues have also written about this, is that, of course, in the shipyards in the Philippines, the Chinese were also employed to construct these Manila galleons. But I'm afraid I cannot yet tell you too much about it. And unfortunately, also the evidence, there is not that much evidence. The documents I repeatedly come across this, that the Spaniards are complaining about not sufficient carpinteros, about
All right.
carpenters, sorry, and not sufficient carpenters, and that they also tried to recruit local people or so. And Chinese were also at least among the carpenters in the Philippines. I have not yet found any evidence if they might have been employed also in shipyards in the Americas, but it's possible, yeah.
Fascinating. Okay, let's move on to Harold Cook's question. This description of mice in a 15th century Bencao text is surprising. Is this evidence strong and secure for the description being real mice? And if so, how could an American food plan have come to East Asia in that era?
Yeah, the Chinese colleague, he argues that it might have been used or existed in parts of what is now northern India or so, and come through the continental Silk Road actually to China. But of course, the question is, and I cannot answer this, and I think we just have this textual evidence. We cannot check if this is truly, mice or so. We would need a genetic, investigation or so. But if it's true, of course, then the Portuguese and Spanish only reintroduced it. But if the question comes from somebody who can read Chinese, I can recommend the Chinese book by my colleague, but he also, of course, he cannot answer this question. It's we do not know for sure, but at least it's possible. But it might be a plant that it's only similar.
Right. Okay. We have lots of questions, so I'd like to combine the two questions addressed by Guopeng Chen. Do we have archaeological records for these connections? And do we know when are the earliest Chinese immigrants in Central and South America? How much do we know about their life?
Archaeological evidence, of course, we have sunken galleons. Of course, most of the evidence stems from the Philippine waters. Colleagues also investigate a sunken galleon off the Japanese coast. Of course, lots of ships got lost in the Pacific, but because the waters are too deep, most of them will be lost probably forever. It's very cost intensive. Some have been excavated also from the American coast, but this is much more difficult. So most stem from the Philippine archipelago waters or the Marianas. And maritime archaeologists are still working, of course, on this. The first Chinese coming to the Americas, of course, this is difficult. You have seen this census stamped from the early 17th century, and there we have some names, and at least some they are definitely Chinese. But I would suppose that as early as when this galleon trade started officially in the 1565, that already in the decades following, also some Chinese just boarded these ships, and then they settled in Mexico or in Peru. But this is very difficult to say. We, of course, also have evidence about a Chinese community in Mexico City, for example. How did they come there in the 16th century? So they most of them probably came there. So there is a very brief article also, the Chinese in Mexico City, for example. So we have some evidence, but it's, of course, we can't know when the first Chinese came to Mexico or to Peru, but probably in the 16th century.
Okay. Harold could follow up and say maybe the reference to maize could be sorghum.
Yeah, it's
possible.
As I mentioned, it's
hard to answer.
Yeah, it's hard It's hard to answer. Yeah.
All right, Xiaoling Duan, thank you, Angela, for the fascinating talk. I wonder how Spanish documents wrote about China at the same time. What aspect did they recall? And do you see any contrast or comparison with Chinese document of Peru?
What the Spanish documents tell about China also. Of course, we have many different documents, and you might know, I think, yeah, especially my Spanish colleague Manel Oller has, and also some other colleagues have written about this, that the Spaniards for some time, they even had in mind that they could conquer China. There was an idea about this. And then the descriptions, of course, it's much also about the wealth and what can be obtained, of course, the silk and some other things. But it's very difficult to reply to this question because there are so many different documents about so many aspects, but it should be known that the Spaniards for some time were even thinking about conquering China, of course, and they had to give up these plans. And then, of course, many speak about about this spread of Catholic faith and about the missionary activities in China. This fills many documents, and sometimes the for our purposes really interesting. I think these are just a few lines, within a lot of information about religion and how the missionary work goes in China, things like this. And between the lines, then we find some other information.
Oh, that's interesting. All right, let's move on to David Rody. Was trade in beads, B-E-A-D-S, something that also show up in the old records?
Yeah, I think beads was also something, but I rarely, it's not frequently, but it was also part of this trade,
Oh, okay. All right. The next question by Henry Smith. One of the most profitable Spanish exports to Europe was the red insect dye cochineal. And I get that there is evidence that it was also carried to China or the Spanish galleon. Do you have documentation of this? Also, I would like to know whether any of the cochineal originated in Peru. Today, the greatest producer in the world is Peru.
Yeah, there are actually also some colleagues who wrote especially about this trade, and it was also transported to China. But as far as I recall, in the end, the transportation to China, it was too expensive. And I must admit, at the moment, I don't recall exactly where it was produced, but I think I can recall that it was exported through Callao. This is the port of Lima. So it was exported through the port of Lima, but I can't recall where it was produced. I will have to check the article I have in mind, because there are at least 2 articles or respectively book chapters who especially wrote about this.
Right. We need to move on because we have a lot of questions. The next question, I think a lot of people are interested in maize. So basically it's the same question about, before, the 17th century. Did Indians from South America trade directly, or the Spanish? Did Indians form South America trade directly?
We know, for example, this trade, one might think that only Spanish were involved. I already showed various examples that Portuguese were involved. You also find Indians, of course, Indian people, they also went to Spanish America. We also have evidence of Indians. You find Armenians also there. The Armenians played also quite an important role. And we find Greek pilots. So this whole business was really very, very international. Yeah. Okay. You read about rowers from Malaysia and Sasid Greek pilots, and also it was very international. And Indians were also involved.
Great. Robert Patch want to ask, where in China were light cotton textile produced, which show up in El Salvador and Honduras in the late 18th century?
It was in the Jiangnan area. Definitely, so yeah.
Okay. Sean Yuan asks, any missionaries were sent to China from the New Spain? It seems unlike the China's contact with the Europeans, exchanges between China and the New World largely focus on the trade.
I didn't really get what the question was.
Well, the question is there any missionaries sent to China?
Yes, many.
Yeah.
And most of what we know actually is from missionaries, just because they were for religious purposes sent there. But many missionaries were at the same time also merchants. And
in Angela's,
they were not merchants at the same time. They were engaged in this kind of exchange.
Okay. So Nicole Lunar, this is my student. In Spanish territories like the Philippines, did the Chinese immigrants make Chinese style ceramics?
Actually, I must admit, I don't know enough about this. Most of the ceramics I know about were produced on the Chinese mainland, but
great.
Because it depends, of course, on the kaolin clays or so that. But they probably produced some simple earthenware things also in Manila. But we know that many other products, for example, these figurines of ivory or things like this, these were produced, for example, also in workshops in the Philippines, in Manila.
Okay, Wang Xiaoming, I want to congratulate you on the excellent talk. The question is about terms of a trade structure. China's exports were mainly handmade or processed goods, while imports were mainly natural products from tropical regions and herbal medicine, which had a positive effect on the development of the pre-modern global economy. Is this a valid conclusion?
No one still has to stress that the major import was, of course, silver. Silver into China, and in the form of silver coins that were later even circulating in parts of Guangdong and Fujian province. So the main export was silver, of course.
All right. Sean Yuan want to follow up. Did the Spanish ever landed in China like the Portuguese to interact with the Chinese, or they only stay in Manila?
No. They, of course, they also, many went to China. And as I mentioned, the idea was in the end also even that they could conquer China or so. And
right. I'm sorry, I have to move on. You know, if you ask a question, I have to move on to give other people some opportunity. Here is the question: did African slaves ever arrive in China?
Yeah, there is a book by Tatiana Seijas who wrote about these chinos or so, and records say sometimes that slaves that they came from Africa or so, or they speak about from the Arabian lands. So we have some evidence, but not much. And of course, we have to be very, very careful if they speak generally about these terms. But most probably it was, for example, Arab or Indian merchants who were involved in the Western Indian Ocean region, and they carried some slaves. And then the Portuguese, they who were very, very active in the slave trade, then they shipped them further to the Americas.
All right. Moving on, an audience wonder if you could provide links to Chinese in the port of Astoria in Whitacoat, America.
If I could provide what?
Some information about Chinese in the port of Astoria in Whitacoat, Americas. Is there any information? No, sorry. Okay.
Maybe there is information I can provide it at this moment.
All right. Franz Vandenbusch, what's your opinion on Charlotte Harris Reed's book, Secret Maps of the Ancient World, the Asiatic Fathers of America? What do you think about Gavin Manny's book, 1421?
Yeah, this is a big story, but of course, there is absolutely no evidence for this. This is just we colleagues and myself also included. We have written some articles. If you are interested, we just reject this kind of speculation.
Right. So please visit the website that I sent at the very beginning of the talk. You know, the Crossroad Research Center has lots of very interesting information, academic information. All right, I think that we move on to the final questions. Kristen Enric do you have information about the cultivation of cinchona in Peru? Also, would it be possible to receive the information on the article about the Chinese in Mexico City?
Okay, I will have to make a note. Yeah. No, there is, of course, especially botanists have written a lot about this. And I myself, of course, learned a lot from them when reading, where they were cultivated, what kind of circumstances they need, and how also, this cinchona and how it was won, how it was traded, and we read a lot, especially from the Peruvian hinterlands. There are many documents on this.
Right. All right. Let's move on to Lucille Jia from UC Riverside. Thanks for this really fascinating talk. The chocolatero is actually an earthenware pot made in Puebla, Mexico. One of the important results of importing so much ceramic ware from China and other parts of Asia is that it inspired the local ceramics industry in Spanish America. So that's a comment.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I appreciate this because I talk about that particular country as well. All right, great. Moving on, our time is already over, but I think we can entertain one more question from Zoe Lin. Can you suggest some literation on the role Fujian merchants play in the exchange?
Yeah, I think the dissertation, for example, I mentioned in my talk by Guillermo Ruiz-Tobel. This is on this trade. It's in English. I can really recommend it. Yeah.
All right. Great. I think
because of the local industries, it's true that also in other cities in what is now Mexico, Puebla, a local industry was created. The same attests also to kind of fabrics, and it's interesting. You might think that all these products from China, they were circulating only among the local social elites, but actually a colleague has from Argentina has earlier already found out that locally they produce cheaper copies, and then also these were circulating also among the ordinary people or so. So this China trade really had a great impact on local society.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for all the comments and questions. This is a really stimulating talk, and we thank Angela Schottenhammer one more time for your inspiration. I will give the floor to Julia to conclude today's event. Thank you so much, Professor Schottenhammer. Very successful talk.
Thank you.
Yes, Angela, thank you so much for your presentation today, and especially for sharing with us this depth of research that you have done on early modern connections among China, Spanish Americas, and the Philippines via the maritime trade routes. We really cannot thank you enough. And I think the audience reaction to all the questions shows how much people were intrigued and wanted to learn more. Our special appreciation today also goes to Susan and her colleague at Rice University, Eric Huntington, for organizing this series. Susan, as always, our heartfelt thanks to you both. Finally, to our viewers, sincere gratitude for joining us today. We greatly appreciate you and your support. So our webinar series will continue on March 9th, 1 month from today, with a presentation by Anne Blackburn, who is the Old Dominion Foundation Professor in the Humanities and the Chair of the Department of Asian Studies at Cornell University. Again, Anne Blackburn's talk will be on Thursday, March 9th. We look forward to seeing you then. From all of us at KU Leuven, Rice University, and the Dunhuang Foundation, we wish you all a restful remainder of the day or a good evening, depending on where you are. Until we next meet, thank you and have a good afternoon. Goodbye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.